Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled The Rise of Selective Distribution, Protect and Grow Your Brand in the Age of E-Commerce. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, application widgets you can use. All of the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the private Q&A widget without disturbance to the program. We will try to answer these at the end of the webinar, but if a more detailed answer is needed or we run out of time, it'll be answered later via email. Lastly, if you're having technical issues, you can find answers to common technical troubles located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen, or you may submit a question via the Q&A widget. An on-demand version of the webinar will be available approximately 24 hours from now and can be accessed using the same audience link that was previously sent to you. And now I'd like to turn the call over to Darren Garcia, partner with Voorhees eControl.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for your attendance today. We're going to be talking about the rise of selective distribution and its role in protecting and growing your brand in the age of e-commerce, and in particular, the age of online marketplaces. Just very briefly, as Sarah mentioned, I'm a partner in Voorhees eControl, which is a part of the Voorhees law firm. It's a large old law firm based in the States that developed the eControl practice, which is a multidisciplinary group of professionals in the business, legal, technology, investigatory areas of expertise that specialize in helping companies to attain online sales control and leverage that control to drive commercial value and outcomes. I'm joined by my colleague in Europe, Beckett Mcgrath, who is a partner at Euclid Law, which is a boutique competition firm based in London and Brussels that has significant expertise in digital distribution, e-commerce, and related issues. As we think about the category of eControl and our expertise, we've advised close to 500 companies on these issues, including a number of companies in Europe, on how to lawfully exert control over online sales, leveraging true solutions. What you'll see as you are challenged by these issues and your companies go looking for how best to face them and overcome them, you will see a number of providers touting monitoring or takedowns or other various tools. And what we've found over the course of working with the companies that we've worked with is that solutions are really what are needed here. And putting together the right control components for your company and bringing those to bear in a way that will address your unique situation in an end-to-end, very integrated manner and allow you to drive specific commercial outcomes rather than, relatively meaningless metrics like sellers removed or violation notices sent or things like that. Everything that we do is tailored to driving business results, typically maximize sales, maximize brand equity, and overall protection and growth of your brands. So, why are we here? Well, up until very recently, whatever happened with respect to your products was in terms of once they left you, the manufacturer, the brand owner, and went into distribution, it really didn't matter where or how products were resold because there was very little transparency, very little ability to see what was going on from one country to the next or one city to the next. And so brands really didn't care about downstream issues. And I guess, following on that, unauthorized sales were not a major concern for most companies. There was really no, they may be annoyances to the people within companies in charge of gray market issues or counterfeit issues or things like that. But, in terms of the overall performance and brand health of a business, it really didn't rise to that level. As we've reached the age of e-commerce, and in particular the rise of online marketplaces like Amazon, which is just growing and expanding at a significant rate across Europe, and tag-along marketplaces are as well. And we, this just has been even further exacerbated. Some have said, advanced by a factor of 10 years in light of COVID disruption and the fallout from all of that. It is really compounding what was already a relatively astounding growth rate across the various European markets. And, all of these trends are predicted to accelerate, and many companies have just been caught off guard by this. Certainly from just a purely commercial standpoint, how do we trade there? How do we operate there? But also with respect to the disruption that it has caused their channels, their customer relationships, their brands overall. And what you see is, the people that study these sorts of things from an academic perspective will say, that retail has undergone a lot of transformation over the past 50 years. You have shopping malls, to large big box retailers, to club channels, to all different sorts of permutations that did, in fact, cause disruption and cause companies to have to rethink strategies and the like. But with online marketplaces, the disruption that they've caused, and the quote says, is upending the sector, again, the retail sector that is, and doing so with unprecedented speed and reach. And so this has just never happened before. And why is it so disruptive? Well, today you have a giant billboard in the name, that is Amazon, that sits atop the world and tells everybody what to think about your product, what the value of your product is, and is fully transparent, oftentimes being driven by anonymous operators, having dynamic pricing algorithms, an open platform through which any unauthorized seller able to get a hold of your product can turn around and resell. And this has just caught a great many companies totally flat-footed. And, in Europe, the distribution strategies that have traditionally existed for a long time, various limitations that they pose are being exploited and really beginning to harm companies as the online marketplace disruption continues to advance. Namely, chief among them, the inability to control downstream resellers and no ability to enforce against unauthorized online resellers of your product. And so what happens? Well, as the marketplaces expand, as more sellers begin to participate on them, as the massive chaos ensues, you have a breakdown in ability to control your distribution, which leads to rampant unauthorized sales, which leads to the very quick erosion of your brand equity. And what we've seen is, certainly in the States, which has been, a few years ahead in terms of e-commerce advancement, size, and things of that nature, and now beginning to roll across Europe, is that your organizations will be harmed if your sales channels are not strategically and holistically managed to account for online disruption. The days of we're just going to do it how we've always done it, and we're going to have our head in our sand in the sand, and we this team in this country does this thing, and this team in another country does their own thing. Those days are quickly waning, and to the extent your company doesn't pivot into that, you're going to be reacting from a much more difficult space when it finally catches up with you and you're forced to. And so, the cycle that ensues, okay, as brands do not quickly enough pivot into this new reality, is if you start like at 3 o'clock on this slide, you have traditional, offline business practices, whether it's sales incentives, volume incentives to distributors, liquidation practices, return policies, sales commission incentives with your off-channel sales teams. Pretty soon, products begin to drift out of your authorized channels into the hands of unauthorized sellers, product diverters, and the like. now that Amazon and other marketplaces sit there welcoming them with open arms, they go there and sell with very little to no investment in your brand, free riding off of all of the investment that you and your good customers have put into your products over the years, which leads to, as you get to high noon, a mass amount of sellers selling online, brand equity degradation, lack of investment in the brand, meaning that high-quality customers begin to pull back their desire to invest in your brand and help you to grow, chargebacks in the e-commerce space, in the brick-and-mortar world, and harm to growth. That inevitably then spills over into the brick-and-mortar channel where you have significant channel conflict, and the cycle rinses and repeats until the companies do something and engage in the self-help necessary to break that chain. And as we've worked in this space and advised companies across just about every vertical, every product category that there is, what one thing has sort of come through loud and clear across all verticals, all product types, B2B, B2C, you name it, is that a holistic solution is required, okay? You have a lot of companies out there saying, I need to fix Amazon, or a tech vendor saying, let me do enforcement for you on Amazon, or I have something that can scrape Amazon. The reality, however, is that Amazon sits there and is simply just a reflection of what's going on below the waterline in your channel ecosystem, okay? So if you're below the waterline setup here and operations and customer relationships and channel dynamics are such that there is incentive, opportunity, ability for products to leave your authorized channels of trade and find their way on Amazon, they will, and they will continue to do that and continue to hurt you until you step in and exert control over that. And so that's what this slide is saying, is there is a holistic solution that is needed. Amazon is but the tip of the iceberg, and you can sit there and play whack-a-mole and flail around there all day long, but until you look below the waterline and step in and exert the control that's necessary, you will not solve your problem. And as we get into this, we say, well, how can companies get control? What is the solution? Well, it's multifaceted, okay? And we call it eControl. The market refers to it as eControl, but it has three primary components. So we're going to focus the remainder of our talk today largely on the middle component. But we begin first with strategy. Okay, what are the commercial outcomes we're trying to achieve? What is our business goal? Okay, because this is not a one-size-fits-all, one tool solves all world, okay? Depending on what your business goals are will dictate the correct foundation, enforcement strategy, and everything flows from that. So settling on what your business goal is and what are the KPIs, what are the key performance indicators that are going to be indicative of overall sales and channel and brand health, okay? For many companies, one key metric, particularly in Europe, is going to be the sales being driven by your authorized sellers online, whether that's Amazon, whether that's a third-party seller, whether that's your own storefront. What is the percentage of ownership of the Amazon buy box that you have in that channel? Okay, and there are others that we'll get into, but really getting clear on what are your goals and what are the key KPIs that are going to be reflective of those goals. It's not going to be takedowns of unauthorized sellers. It's not going to be violation notices or other kind of vanity metrics. It's what's going to drive to that real business outcome that you're trying to achieve. Now, once we're clear on that, now we can go ahead and build the foundation necessary to support it. Okay, because a number of things are true in Europe. Number one, once you intentionally put product into the European Economic Area, you really lose the ability to exert intellectual property claims and do those types of takedowns on anything online. Most of you will know on this call that resale price maintenance, things like MAP or UPP or anything like that, is not allowed in Europe. It's illegal. So you can't do any form of downstream resale price maintenance or have any type of technology geared to maintaining resale prices or anything like that. That's something that fine in the States, but you've got to stay completely away from it in Europe. So what's the foundation that we need? And so Beckett will get into that. And then the ability to enforce. So we can go out, have a basis to enforce through our foundation, and then B, be able to conduct that enforcement, not to get rid of a seller for the sake of getting rid of a seller, but to figure out what is really disrupting my business outcomes, tailoring and driving my enforcement against those disruptive actors, all with an eye towards how am I really moving the needle from a business perspective. So that is really the three-step process that needs to be brought to bear in Europe. And there's no kind of one-off tool or trick or technology or anything that's going to policy agreement, anything that's going to do that for you. You have to string together that holistic solution. And so, starting first on the strategy piece, one of the first things you want to think about if you're not clear on is how are you going to go to market on the marketplaces. A lot of companies say, well, I have a 1P relationship with Amazon, or I'm going to sell through my own third-party storefront. But as you get into it, you realize that they may say they're 1P, but everybody else in their channel is selling there as well. Or they may say, well, we have a 3P model, but they're owning 20% of the buy box because it's the rest of it's split up across 15 other resellers that are selling there as well. And so you really need to be intentional, particularly in Europe, about what do we want to look like here? And do we want only those resellers selling our stuff that are invested in the brand? Do we want only the highest quality of experienced resellers? Do we want to limit down our distribution or really curate our distribution? Or, do we believe that we're in a highly commoditized world and we just need to be out as far and wide as possible? And then what are our existing commercial relationships and what rights have we given before we realize the marketplace dynamics at play? But getting really clear on that will allow you to begin to design the right Amazon go-to-market strategy for you if you're not already there, or perhaps pivot from what you already have, and then we can design backwards from there. But that's a very big and important first step. And so, all of this leading up to saying that there's a massive wave of disruption underfoot. It will hurt your company if you're not actively engaging with it, planning for it, making changes in light of it. We have to start with our strategy and think about where do we really want to go? What's the business goal that we're trying to drive? What are the KPIs that will indicate success or progression towards achievement of those goals? And now what's the foundation that we need to put in place to support that? And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Beckett Mcgrath, who's one of the most well-renowned practitioners in the selective distribution space in Europe, partner at Euclid and a founding participant in the eControl Global Coalition. And he'll talk with you about that enforcement, the foundation piece. So Beckett, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Darren. So I guess like any good lawyer, I'll define my terms. So the first question is, what is selective distribution? I think, Darren, you're now doing the slides great. So the key aspect is that the brand will basically undertake only to distribute its products to a network of authorized sellers. And those authorized sellers have been chosen on the basis of criteria. And that enables you to say either who's in the network or who's out of the network. And importantly, authorized sellers can only sell either to end users or to other authorized sellers, and sales to unauthorized sellers are strictly prohibited. And that's important because normally that kind of resale restriction would raise competition law problems, but in a selective distribution setup, that is inherent. Now, selective distribution was traditionally employed by luxury, high-quality, high-technology brands, either that they've got an aura of luxury or they're technically complex. And that was important before, but it's less important now, which I'll get on to explain. What we've seen is more recently it's been adopted by a much wider variety of brands, including a whole range of household products, for example. Now, I think we'll get into the detail a bit of what these criteria mean, but I think it's just important that brands think about how do I want my product to be presented and what kind of things do I want people selling my product to have? What attributes should they have? And as the last bullet said, it's an important critical foundation for being able to take action against authorized sellers who are leaking product or selling ways that are not compliant with the agreement, but it's also an important stepping stone to being able to take action against unauthorized sellers. And just to give you a bit of background, the idea is that competition overall is enhanced by selective distribution. So whilst it's completely implicit in the case law, even explicit in the case law going back 40 years or more, that selective distribution leads to a loss of price competition, subject to, as we heard just now, that you can't have resale price maintenance. But the idea is that the benefits are that it's good for the quality of the product and for ensuring a uniform and high quality sales experience. So if we get onto this quote, the European Commission did a big study a few years back on e-commerce. And one of the things they found was the selective distribution was getting more popular, particularly in response to the rise of online retail. And it was becoming more prevalent in a multitude of ways. One was that brands that had never used selective distribution were adopting it. Other ways were brands were adding it just for certain high-end products, so they could have had a tiered model with just their prestige products subject to selective distribution. Or brands were adding new criteria to take account of online distribution. So to go on to the process in the next slide, it's important to start with thinking what you want, and that will reflect your brand and how you want it to be sold. And as we'll get on to shortly, market share is important for the legal risk analysis. It needn't be overly complex. I tend to, you can use a lot of common sense and get a long way with common sense. People can get a bit hung up about market share. I'm not saying you should go off and instruct economists and do a massive exercise. In fact, we at Euclid have access to a third-party tool, which is a database of all the previous decisions of the European Commission, of national authorities. It's not necessarily definitive, but it gives you a very good guidance of how markets have been defined in past cases. Then you look at what the criteria are. Critically, you create the contracts. Now, that's often the bit where you get groans, particularly from non-lawyers, and that's fair enough. We're used to that. But the key thing is, as Darren said, it's the foundation for future enforcement. If you don't have the agreements in place, if they're not compliant, if they're not properly implemented and policed going forward, then when it comes to actually wanting to enforce against someone, you really don't have a leg to stand on. You've got to have that legal foundation. And then, as I say, when you're looking at criteria, you need to look at how is the sales experience different online and offline. And in online, you might want to differentiate between regular, like the reseller's own website, or a third-party marketplace. So what are the criteria? How do I want my product sold? We'll get back onto criteria shortly. And then as part of the sort of implementation in box 6, you then have to actually approach your existing resellers, because often what we find is brands already have an ecosystem in place. It's just not working for them for the reasons we've touched on, because it may be based on exclusive distribution. And they maybe need to take account of their sensitivities, but they also need to understand that it is a different world. There is a fundamental difference between exclusive distribution and selective distribution. So next slide. Again, I won't dwell too long on this market definition, but it's important to look at what the brand wants, where it sits in the marketplace. I mean, in the, frankly, in my experience, relatively unusual situation where the brand has a very high market share in their particular segment, then you may need to adopt a more conservative approach. But frankly, most retail markets are highly fragmented, and it's rare that you see market shares above 30%, at least on the brand level. It does happen, but regularly that's not something that should take too long. And so the options depend on the market share, because just to give a bit of background, a key aspect of the regime, which we're not dwelling on today because it's a legal issue, is the verticals block exemption regulation, which is shortened there as VEBA. And that creates a safe harbor from European competition law that otherwise would apply to anti-competitive agreements. And if you fit within that safe harbor, you are immune from legal challenge unless a competition authority specifically decides to take your agreement out of that safe harbor. And that has never happened, at least as far as we can tell, certainly not on the European level. And so that gives you a lot of security that you are safe. And the idea is that vertical agreements generally are not problematic, and as long as the parties' market shares are not too high, and there are no hardcore restrictions of competition, no serious restrictions, which we'll get onto, then that is presumptively legal and safe from challenge. And I think that's important to bear in mind, because I was looking back earlier today at some of the old case law around what's described as purely qualitative selective distribution, the Metro criteria. Some of you may have heard about that, but that was all around defining a type of selective distribution that fell outside competition law altogether. So it was immune from challenge without having to worry about a block exemption. That used to be important because of the way the law works. So it used to be very, very important not to get caught by competition law at all. Since 1999, there's been a modern vertical safe harbor. And since 2003, courts have been able to make an individual weighing up assessment if an agreement ever came before them. So it's really important. I mean, it's obviously nice if you're way outside competition law altogether, if you are purely qualitative. But if that doesn't work for your business, you don't need to get too hung up about it. You don't need to get hung up about whether your product is a luxury product or technically complex, or whether your criteria are objectively justified. The European Commission has made it very clear in its guidance that if you're below 30%, you can have whatever criteria you like, you can apply them however you like, and you can have whatever product you like. You're in the safe harbor. So that's super important in terms of the overall legal analysis. So I think moving on to the next slide, these criteria, now starting with offline, because that's the kind of traditional model that we're used to thinking of. As I said earlier, they're really about the experience, the store environment, the ability of the shop to provide the appropriate setting. And again, it was interesting looking back at one of these old cases. It was the Leclerc case from the mid-90s. There, where that was a perfume selective distribution agreement, the criteria go on for pages in the judgment, and they're all around the location of the store, the size of the windows in the store, the other products that the store was carrying. I mean, you can really go to town on that, but it really depends on the product. If you don't need that, if your product is a consumer electronics device, then the main thing is that people can touch your product, can get a demonstration of the product. Doesn't necessarily matter whether the store is on a premium high street retail location or a back street within reason. So applying that online, the Commission is completely comfortable with the idea that you can have criteria that determine who can sell a product online, because ultimately the brand has a legitimate interest in its products being presented appropriately, and that should apply in the online world just as in the offline world. And whilst the current guidelines, which are 10 years old and are being reviewed, they reflect a rather unsophisticated view of the internet, where the internet was seen as a bit like the Wild West. I mean, now there are clearly very, very high quality online marketplaces that provide a very high quality online environment. So it's very clear that luxury products, I mean, the luxury brands themselves sell their products online. So there's not that division anymore between sort of offline good, online bad. It's all about how the product is sold online. And the idea is that, broadly speaking, online criteria should be equivalent to the offline one. They shouldn't be pushing things too far so that de facto nobody can meet them to sell online, because that would be a no-no. So quantitative criteria, that's the additional element that takes you into the quantitative selective distribution box, and that just means some sort of numerical limit. That can just be an absolute limit, like we're only going to have 10 resellers in our network, or it can be based on the quantity of sales or the size of the store. It's just something that has a number, so there's no magic in that. So on the next slide, I've set out just some examples. I mean, as I said earlier in reference to that Leclerc case, you can go to town on these, or you can keep them simple. The idea of this list, I won't go through it individually, but it's just there as a sort of starting point, as a menu. And again, there was a case in litigation in the English courts, L'Oreal and Beauty Bay, which unfortunately, like most of these cases, settled. But that was also around the criteria applied by L'Oreal and the nature of how they've been applied to exclude a discounter in that case. So it's really about just thinking, how do I want my product to be sold, and how can I specify that to provide that high quality environment and the high quality presentation of the brand. Again, moving on to the next slide, online criteria. As you'll see, they just carry that across. I mean, the one to touch on there without spending too long, because I could do a whole hour on this, is the marketplace ban. And there was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion in the literature around is it legitimate for a brand to stop its resellers selling on online third-party marketplaces as opposed to selling online altogether, banning online sales altogether. And it's now very clear that it is legitimate for a brand, or it may be legitimate for a brand to say no marketplace sales at all, or it can say you can only sell on pre-approved marketplaces that we at the brand have concluded are sufficiently high quality. Because as I say, marketplaces can stretch from the sort of far-fetches of this world through to very low quality flea markets online. So there's a huge range there. So next slide. Again, this is very straightforward quantitative criteria. As I said earlier, it's just anything to do with numbers. You don't even need to say how many, you don't need to communicate how many resellers you have. If you decide you've got 10 resellers and an 11th person comes along, then as long as your market share is under 30%, then you can say, sorry, we're full. You don't have to say any more than that. As I said earlier, I went over it on online sales. They've got to be equivalent to brick and mortar, and it's a good idea to be able to justify them. I mean, whilst I said earlier that if you're in the safe harbor, it's clear from Commission guidance, you can have whatever criteria you like. It's always good to sort of pass the blush test. If a competition authority does come knocking, you've got to at least be able to say something about why you have the criteria so it's not seen as some other thing. I mean, the thing to watch out for, as Darren mentioned earlier, is resale price maintenance. And you can't have something in there that's a covert ban on discounting. You also can't have something in there which is a covert ban on online retailers or a covert ban on cross-border retailers, because it's as it says here, you can't have, in that fourth box in the bottom right, you can't have any restrictions on cross-sales between sellers within a selective distribution network. So ideally, if you've got one network covering the whole of Europe, all sellers have to be able to sell freely within that. Any attempt to segment things nationally or say, I'm not going to admit you because you are selling in Germany from France, that's a big no-no. Other ones are price restrictions, that's obvious. Online sales bans or discrimination. Now that's a really interesting one because, I mean, it was effectively settled in the Pierre Fabre case that you can't just say, I mean, that case was saying, if you want to sell our cosmetics, you've got to sell them in a pharmacy with a pharmacist present, which ruled out online sales. That is a no-no. But, and for example, the golf club manufacturer Ping was recently fined by the UK Competition and Markets Authority £1.45 million for requiring an in-store demo for custom-fitted clubs. Even though ostensibly they had a justification, they took that on appeal to the Court of Appeal in the UK and they lost. The European Commission fined Guess, the fashion brand Guess, €40 million for trying to keep online markets to itself. So that's all clear. These are just big no-nos. And you can get some wrinkles around the edges about how you're applying discount schemes. You can't have a discount scheme that gives resellers better discounts for offline versus online sales. There's some wrinkles there, but I won't dwell on that today because that's not the focus. So I think, Darren, back to you.
Yeah. So, just a couple of things just in the many rollouts that we've done, and Sarah Long, Beckett's partners on as well, and we've all worked together on a number of these. I think there are a couple of just misconceptions that brands have. I mean, at the highest level, selective distribution, on the commercial side, we're really, allow you, provided that, it's all been vetted and is compliant, to really curate who it is that is selling your products. And it's just so important today to be able to do that, and you just don't have that ability at the necessary level with other forms of distribution. As you start to see your brand story, your brand performance, your sales being dictated by people, other than you, and just basically a victim of wherever your products go and however they get there, and they show up online in ways that you don't want. you really have one path forward, and I just want to stress that. And you may run into people internally that have an outdated view of selective distribution, that, oh, it's too hard or it's too expensive, or your lawyers may say, well, that's just for luxury products. And I just want to just plant the seed here that is indeed, it's kind of an outdated, understandable given the history of where this all came up, but outdated insofar as it is not those things. And having done as many of these rollouts as we have, able to advise companies on the most logistically easy, legally compliant, and effective way of doing this that's not going to be particularly disruptive. And another thing is, you don't have to sit there and worry about cutting off all of your good customers. I mean, really what you're trying to do is define your club and who's allowed into it, all within the bounds of the law, which is, where the individual advice and whatnot comes in. But from a commercial outcome, when you talk about protecting and growing your brand in today's market, you will be eroded under other models, and this really is going to be the path forward. But a big reason of why go through all of this comes down to enforcement. Again, you have no basis to enforce, okay, other than selective distribution. I mean, assuming that somebody's not selling counterfeit product, assuming that somebody is selling stuff that you potentially put into Europe, you really don't have any other way to enforce against unauthorized sales. And when you have the foundation in place that Beckett talked about, it allows you to go out and engage in the 360-degree cleanup effort of your brand, being able to monitor, figure out who's selling your product, where, how much, what volume, what revenue they're driving, how disruptive are they, and being able to prioritize those sellers, being able to go in and work to figure out what is the sources of this diversion. Okay, how are these products leaking out? Critically, having the ability to engage in legal enforcement. Otherwise, you're just trying to scare people or just hoping that they'll listen to you, okay? But having that legal foundation, being able to leverage all of your learnings of enforcement to understand what is the root cause of all of this. Why is this happening? Where do the incentives lie? How have I set this up business-wise? Because it does all, basically start and stop with the brands to allow this to happen. And is there anything we can do on the front end to mitigate this? Leveraging certainly any marketplace takedown procedures available to the extent there's an international parallel importation issue and things like that. You may have some other enforcement vehicles available to you. But essentially, being able to conduct that enforcement, identifying your unauthorized seller and the products, determining which sellers are causing the most disruption, determining if they're known to the brand, identifying those product sources, cutting those off wherever you can, okay? And then engaging in the enforcement that selective distribution allows and where you would basically be stuck without it. Going out first with a soft enforcement, saying, hey, thank you for your interest in our brand. We have selective distribution in place. If you have quantitative criteria, just saying, we've reached our limit of resellers. If you're just in a qualitative standpoint, saying, hey, these are my selective distribution requirements. These are my criteria. You're invited to apply to see if you can meet them. And that's basically what I just talked about here. But you have to disclose, that you're able to comply with all of your criteria. I can check up on that. I need to know where your product sources are coming from. Where are you buying from? Where's your inventory coming from? To the extent that people don't comply when they don't meet the criteria, you can then begin a more formal cease and desist process with selective distribution claims, which are going to fall under the various national claims of whichever country the reseller is engaged in. Here's just a few examples in some of the larger European countries here. And then moving into as-needed legal enforcement, to the extent that somebody still is holding out at that last and final stage. And, in our experience, both in Europe and certainly, across hundreds of examples in the U.S., your vast majority of sellers, when they understand that you have a legal foundation, okay, will go and sell something else or will move away, or perhaps you can convert them into an authorized customer if they meet your criteria. But when you don't have that, okay, you're going to get a lot of people thumbing their nose at you and saying there's nothing you can do about it. what I'm doing is perfectly fine, and they would be right. Okay, so you really need to be able to conduct enforcement like this, to be able to have that legal foundation. Now, just briefly on root cause and corrective action, I mean, we do not believe in playing indefinite whack-a-mole that everybody calls it. Okay, we're not out there. Again, I kicked off the top of all of this by saying, you know, we're not into the vanity metrics and numbers of takedowns and things like that. We're into driving commercial value. And so a big part of all of this is surfacing, you know, what is the root cause of my problem? What am I doing, or where am I selling that's allowing all of this to occur? And when you do that and can quantify the business impact of all of that, you can begin to make educated decisions about, should I change something, okay, to mitigate these issues on the back end, or do I just need to accept that for me it's a business reality that I'm going to have to be engaged in frequent, routine, and ongoing enforcement. And that's going to be a different calculus for every company, but being able to drill down, having your foundation, going and doing the necessary investigation and data analysis to figure out where this stuff's coming from, and then beginning to piece together what is it that's causing it. That's really the information that your leadership in your organizations is going to need to have to be able to determine what should we do about this. And so that's a big part of what we do, because, again, we want to give companies that control, okay, in the way that's best for them, that's lawful, and that accounts for the realities of the market so that they can leverage it to drive real business value. That could mean different things for different companies, whether it's negotiating improved terms with an Amazon or other platform based on improved channel health. They're not losing buy box to a bunch of rogue third parties, for example. Increase your profits by increasing the buy box percentage owned by good partners, okay, people out there that are invested in your brand, that are driving your marketing, that are driving your search, and doing those sorts of things so that you are out there and owning those sales. This is, you know, converting sellers purchasing from diverters to purchasing from the manufacturer, bringing them into the fold as authorized customers. I mean, you know, that we've done that a lot. You know, particularly you see that a lot in the brick and mortar diversion world, where, you know, somebody has a big business in your product, you figure out the source of their diversion, and you go to them and say, hey, you know, I have these claims against you, but, you know, you seem to be really good at selling my product. Would you care to buy directly from me? You know, providing the best third-party seller a high percentage of buy box so they can grow the brand. This is where you're getting into your 3P model. Okay, your 3P model is only going to be as good as your third-party seller is at owning the buy box. So how do we design our criteria and our enforcement and our strategy to drive them up in the sales rankings? And then being able to use eControl, the results that you've obtained, your position, your health as a brand, as leverage and a differentiator when you're approaching retailers and distributors and trying to entice their interest in your products. And so, you know, those are really the types of outcomes that we're looking to drive. And, you know, the good thing about Europe, you know, being as strict as it is, you know, when you have your strategy and your program there, okay, it can be modularized across the rest of the world. Everybody else is going to fall, you know, a bit short of the strictures in the European market. And so if you have a compliant and effective program there, you're going to be able to set that up just about anywhere else you're doing business in the world. And so, you know, bringing this all together, again, into that holistic solution process, you know, again, there's no one-off tool or tactic or trick or agreement or policy or data that's going to fix this for you, but weaving together that strategy, foundation, enforcement. What's the go-to-market strategy? What's the necessary enforcement we're going to have to do? What's the nature of our products, our market shares? Getting that stakeholder alignment around a new approach here and implementing the necessary control. Then building out that foundation, getting your selective distribution policies in place with the right criteria that will allow you to curate your channel map and your customers in the way that's best for you as opposed to what's best for them, and prepare and disseminate your channel communications, bring them into the fold, vet those potential resellers, and be able then to leverage that foundation into enforcement so that you can protect the overarching strategy and get to your business goals. And that's really the solution and the process that we've seen be most effective in Europe. So just a couple of things before we turn it over for questions in the last 15 minutes here. We're having another webinar on July 16th, where Beckett and I will speak with Chris Vincent, who's the global CEO of Practicology, a pattern division that is one of the top 3P resellers in the world, and talking about how to leverage a top 3P reseller in selective distribution for optimal Amazon channel performance. In addition, will be a new white paper coming out here in the coming days that recaps a lot of what we talked about here, titled European Distribution Strategy in the E-commerce Age. And just a couple of plugs for those things. So we'll go ahead and look at your questions now in the remaining time that we have. Let me see here. And if you have not submitted questions, please feel free. So Beckett, I don't know if you can see these, and Sarah, somebody has asked, understanding that we can't restrict cross-border sales between resellers, what is the approach when a product requires registration in any country it is being sold into?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because you can get situations where European law and national law conflict. I mean, the great thing about the EU is it's designed to find those and root them out and stop countries doing that. But sometimes that kind of thing is very locally and nationally specific. I mean, I remember a case I did for a computer games company. It wasn't selective distribution because it was computer games, but they required different game SKUs for Germany, because Germany banned the display of swastikas in games, and also didn't allow red blood. You had to recolor your blood. So there was a national requirement, and I took the view that even though European law is supreme, it's hard to argue that a company should have to break the law to sell a product. Now, so it really all requires about what is the registration. Is it based on public safety? Is it based on health? Or is it a more spurious one, particularly if it's a registration requirement that comes from a local trade association rather than from the government under national law? So it depends on the detail.
And if I could just add to that, because we've had some quite interesting run-ins, I should say, with the Cosmetics Directive in the last sort of 12 months or so, because there are some parts of the requirements under the Cosmetics Directive, for example, which make it raise questions around sort of language and how you make sure that you're not preventing cross-border sales while at the same time complying with the Cosmetics Directive. So without getting into any detail on that, I suppose the point to flag is there are often little bumps in the road, and frankly, it's often a bit of a sense check of, well, trying to find the most appropriate way to manage the different regulations. And ultimately, if you're not trying to do anything too dodgy, then it should absolutely be fine. I think where a competition authority would be concerned if you're trying to use registrations or trying to use some other requirements in order to use that as a front for some form of anti-competitive behaviour, that's where it's more likely to be a problem.
Thank you. Here's a question. If a brand determines that it doesn't want to allow 3P marketplace sales, can that action be executed by the marketplace, or is that on the manufacturer and its distribution channel? And all of our experience to date suggests that the enforcement of that, or the execution of that strategy, will lie solely and exclusively with the brand. To the extent that you wish to pursue that strategy, and you approach Amazon or another marketplace and say, hey, people are selling my stuff, but I ban that. Amazon will say, well, that's great that you ban it, but people are still selling here, and that's your distribution problem. That is not our problem. So that's going to be on your shoulders to put the right foundation, again, coming back to that, in place to support that strategy, and then to protect it through enforcement.
I agree. The only slight wrinkle, because quite rightly, as you say, marketplaces are very wary of getting pulled into a dispute between a brand and a reseller. And particularly in Germany, for example, the competition authority views some marketplaces as almost like an essential facility and will be really concerned if the marketplace is kicking off a seller, particularly if they're selling products that are in free circulation and not counterfeit. They're effectively legal. The exception is if you have a hybrid platform that has a 1P and a 3P function. I think we can think of at least one of those. And the 1P arm of that platform has been admitted as a reseller into the selective distribution network, then there is at least an implicit duty on all members of a selective distribution network to help to police that selective distribution network. And that could conceivably include kicking unauthorized sellers off their marketplace that they also run. That hasn't been tested by law, but you can see the logic. But that is a very specific exception. Darren's quite right that in most situations the marketplace is just not going to go there.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Thank you, Beckett. I hadn't thought about that. That would be interesting to try to leverage their participation. Somebody's asked, how can you discover unauthorized sellers on the market, especially on marketplace sites where new sellers are popping out constantly, and how would you track the source? Well, I mean, I guess quite simply, we leverage proprietary technology that monitors for selective distribution compliance. I mean, who your authorized sellers are, be they on .com sites or on marketplace sites, and you know right away whether somebody is unauthorized. You can also monitor compliance with various criteria. And so really the minute that anybody lists on any site, there's really no hiding from the monitoring. It's true that various sellers pop in and out. However, typically, we track them at a merchant ID or other level where, they may change their name, storefront, et cetera, but that does not change. It's the functional equivalent, of their social security number or something like that. So they can say, no, call me Darren or call me Beckett, but underneath it all, there's a code associated with them. So our software that we use is I think, having looked at just about everything, the best out there and the most effective at that. So that's how that's done. Somebody's asked, would you recommend using selectivity in case a brand sells consumer products, the price of which varies greatly, i.e. from €10 to €500? And I'll defer to Beckett. I will say, Sarah and I like to tell this anecdote that, at a conference, a potato chip manufacturer said, I'm being killed by these online marketplaces, all these rogue resellers, they're degrading my brand. My sales are suffering, and the consensus among the experts in Europe that were there was, well, you need selective distribution. So, products in our experience, products all up and down the price spectrum, it can benefit from that. But Beckett, what's your view on that?
Yeah. In principle, yes. I think I would just say that if you're looking at very low-priced products where they're based on a high-volume channel strategy, that can get hard to manage, because the important point about selective distribution, I can't emphasize that enough, is to apply it consistently and properly. Because what you don't want is internal pressures building up and somebody saying, okay, we've got this selective distribution system in place, but for these products, it'd be great to get them into the supermarket so they can sell them in the basket by the door. And then you just can't legitimately say that is part of selective distribution. But the way to deal with that, as I touched on earlier, is just you can have tiers of products. So you can have your standard products that are subject to free distribution that you don't mind where they end up, and the premium products are covered by selective distribution. But price in itself is not the criterion. It's just what is the sales model.
Yeah, I think that's an important point just to drive home, and we see this a lot in the States too, where you don't have to have everything on the model. You can reserve those products for selective distribution that are strategically important. That you have an incredible amount of brand equity built into them, that you don't really want the free riding on your investment, and keep more commoditized, kind of stack them high and sell them fast products perhaps off, but you can being intentional about what you put on around what you intend to force and enforce with respect to and is strategically important to your brand is an option available to you as a manufacturer.
And I think another way of looking at it is how much of the price is down to the brand value, the brand equity. Because you could have a product that costs £10, but if a non-brand product costs £1, then you've still got a lot of that value coming from the brand equity that may justify selective distribution. So it depends on the product.
Yeah, somebody has asked, what is the investment of time, people, and money on the part of the brand to go through the process described? And I'll give the unhelpful classic lawyer answer as it depends. I'll say this, I guess, when we look at that strategy foundation enforcement framework, okay, the first piece of that strategy is where we speak with the brand and we say, okay, what are you trying to do? Like, really, what are your business goals? What are those KPIs that are going to be indicative? And how can we lawfully set you up to be best positioned to achieve them? That we do that for a fairly nominal price. There is some variance, so I don't want to just give a hard number, but it's a four-figure amount. The next phase, that foundational phase, is going to be dependent on your market share. Are there bespoke competitive analyses that are necessary? How many channels do you have? What do you currently have in place, and whatnot? There's wide variance. Typically, that's a five-figure type proposition to get all of your criteria prepared, your policies drafted, rolled out, to the extent that we need to account for existing contracts and things like that, to be able to do that and to help you get those things implemented and appropriately communicated to the field. Once you get to enforcement, you can be as aggressive as you'd like or as modest as you'd like. We will present you with the data of what the level of disruption is, and you can make the business determinations around what level of enforcement that we want to do. When we're doing this, there's no contractual time frame, or you're not obligated to us for a year or anything like that. I mean, you can start, stop, be more aggressive, less aggressive as your commercial situation and goals compel. So that's generally how we price in those three buckets, with the first two being largely fixed amounts depending on the complexity involved, and the enforcement piece then being much more variable depending on your specific goals. So hopefully that helps.
I might, if I can just jump in on that, just to make a couple of comments, I suppose, on time and people, because I think what we have learned through the many brands that we have advised is that what is critical, absolutely critical, for this to go as fast as you want as a business, is to get all the key stakeholders across the business together in that strategy phase. Because having everyone on board from the beginning, and this is not driven, I think that's a really important point to make, actually. This project is not driven by lawyers or the econ people or the business. It's driven by everyone together, working as a team, and willing to get it over the line. And if you get that buy-in from everyone early on, and everyone understands what it means from day one, the process is so much quicker. And that's the thing that I think is critically important. You need to have the buy-in from everyone, from the top of the tree to the bottom.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I forgot that piece. Thank you, Sarah, for that. When companies do have that buy-in and that alignment, okay, we've seen situations where we'll talk and there'll be commercial people on something like this, and they go off and running and they hire us, and they don't bring their legal teams in until the last minute, and the legal people get all upset that they weren't involved on the front end, and things bog down. But when everybody is rowing in the same direction from the start around e-commerce, legal, sales, business unit leader, and aligned on the project, most companies can probably go from strategy through to holding documents in their hand and being ready to roll those out within 60 to 90 days, I would say, if you are committed and have that alignment. But in terms of commitment internally, you're going to have people that own various channels that need to be able to review and agree on how you've set the policies up and the criteria, certainly agreeing at a macro level on what the goals of all of this are. But typically, once that internal working group has signed off on those on those documents, then it can be transitioned down to, a smaller group of stakeholders that are responsible for maintaining the viability and the health of the system going forward. So, and one final question: in the marketplace environment, who is legally responsible for placing the device on the market? That's a very complicated question. I mean, it gets into, is it a 1P product where an Amazon or the marketplace owner has taken title of the product and put it in? Is it a 3P product where title does not pass to the marketplace and rather is held by the seller? I don't think the courts in Europe have addressed this yet. Beckett, maybe you or Sarah, you know otherwise. But in the States, for example, basically every decision, with the exception about one that I believe is still being litigated, has held that the marketplaces, assuming it's a third-party seller placing the product into marketplace warehouses and actually being the owner of the inventory and selling the product, marketplaces are not liable in that situation. There was a woman whose dog leash retracted suddenly and it put her eye out. The seller of the product was nowhere to be found, and some obscure reseller just went underground, disappeared, and she tried to sue Amazon, and basically, courts are still fighting over whether Amazon has any liability in that scenario. Various courts at lower levels went one way, another one went the other way. It went to a full rehearing, and so the cycle continues. But by and large, Amazon has escaped liability for any harms caused by products sold by third-party sellers, on the notion that it simply provides a platform and is not a participant actively in the sale process. So hopefully that addresses that. But we're up on time. Go ahead, Beck, if you have something on that.
No,
yeah.
I wasn't going to get into the product liability question, but I think the key thing, I mean, it is under review in Europe at the moment as to how a marketplace should be viewed in competition law. In my experience, I think it's always really important to maintain the same distinction that you've made. In 3P, the seller is the seller, sets the price, is responsible for that product. Also, in competition law terms, the seller is selling the product to the end user, albeit assisted by the marketplace, whereas in 1P, the seller is the online retailer. So I think as long as you keep clarity on that, but what I found in actual live antitrust investigations is there can be a lot of confusion around that. Is it agency, for example? People go down rabbit holes. But I think as long as you get that clarity between 1P and 3P and maintain that. But we'll see what the European Commission has to say on that, because that's a major focus of the ongoing review at the moment.
Yeah. Well, with that, we'll let you go. Be on the lookout for the white paper, and please do join the next webinar. Give some interesting thoughts around leveraging a really top-notch 3P seller and how they can support the development and growth and protection of your brand in the context of European distribution and selective distribution in particular. But thank you for your attendance. Our contact information is on the slides. And reach out to any one of us, Beckett, Sarah, or myself, to discuss if there's any way we can help your company. So thank you. Thanks again.